The weeks before the wedding became a blur of deadlines, fittings, and appearances, but somewhere in that blur, I found myself working harder than ever to close the distance between us. I planned quiet dinners at home, tried cooking her favorite meals even after long workdays, and left little handwritten notes on her desk, short lines reminding her that I loved her, that I was proud of her, that I couldn't wait to spend forever together. She never ignored them exactly, but her responses were small and contained: a faint smile, a brief thank you, a kiss on the cheek before moving on to whatever task was in front of her. I told myself it was just the stress of the wedding and her workload pulling her away from me, that once the chaos was over, we would settle into a rhythm that felt warmer. But the truth was that the gap between us was growing, and no matter how much I reached for her, she seemed to slip further back into the safety of her walls. There was a night, about 2 weeks before the ceremony, when we attended a high-profile dinner hosted by one of her longtime business partners. The room was filled with people dressed in sleek suits and shimmering gowns, the kind of crowd that moved through conversations like a dance. From the moment we walked in, she played the role flawlessly, her hand in mine, her voice warm and rich as she introduced me to people I'd never met, her laugh so convincing that I caught myself wondering if it was real. She called me her better half more than once, complimented me in front of the table, and even tucked a strand of my hair behind my ear in a way that felt intimate to everyone watching. I tried to let myself enjoy it, to believe it was more than performance, but deep down, I recognized the pattern. This was her public self, the charming, magnetic woman everyone admired. When we finally got home that night, I waited for her to carry some of that warmth through the door with us. I wanted her to drop the performance and keep holding me, keep looking at me like I mattered beyond the eyes of others. But as soon as the front door closed, she slipped off her heels, hung her coat on the rack, and disappeared into her office without a word. I stood there for a moment in my dress, the faint scent of champagne still on my skin, and felt the weight of the shift. The silence in our apartment was so thick it almost had a texture, and I hated that it felt so familiar. I hated that I knew the pattern so well I could predict it down to the second. The closer the wedding came, the more I began to question what we were building. I still loved her, God, I loved her in a way that made no sense, in a way that survived all the coldness and the distance, but I couldn't ignore the ache of wondering if she loved me in the same way. Did she see me as a partner, or was I just a perfect fit for the image she wanted to project? The thought haunted me late at night, lying beside her in bed while she scrolled through her phone or read documents until her eyes closed. Sometimes I would reach for her hand under the covers, and she would let me hold it for a few seconds before slipping it away, not unkindly, but as if it was an afterthought she couldn't keep. I started looking for signs, tiny proofs that I wasn't imagining the love between us. The way she rested her palm against my back when guiding me through a crowded room. The way she glanced at me during interviews, quick and fleeting, like she was checking to see if I was okay. The way her voice softened on the phone when she said my name, even if the rest of the conversation was clipped and businesslike. I gathered these moments like fragile pieces of glass, careful not to drop them, terrified that if I did, there would be nothing left. One evening, I tried again to bridge the gap. I suggested we skip another social event and spend the night just the two of us. She hesitated, then agreed, and I felt a spark of hope. I made dinner, lit candles, put on soft music. For the first hour, it almost felt like the night I'd been waiting for. She asked me about my day, she laughed at something I said, she even leaned over to kiss my forehead while I was pouring the wine. But slowly, she drifted away again, her eyes drawn back to her phone, her mind already somewhere else. By dessert, we were sitting in silence, and I felt that familiar loneliness settle into my bones. I wanted to tell her then how much I missed her, even when she was sitting right in front of me. I wanted to say that I didn't need the public displays, the glamorous events, the admiration of strangers, I just needed her. But the words caught in my throat, because I knew that saying them out loud might push her further away. So instead, I smiled, cleared the plates, and told myself that maybe after the wedding, after all this pressure was gone, we would finally find our way back to each other. I held on to that hope like it was the only thing keeping me from falling apart completely. The following evening, I stood in front of the building she had told me to come to, my fingers curling tighter around the strap of my worn bag as I craned my neck to look up at the tall glass structure. It was the kind of place I'd only ever walked past, the kind where the lobby alone probably cost more to maintain than I'd earned in an entire year. The glass door slid open without a sound when I stepped forward, and a uniformed concierge greeted me by name before handing me a sleek keycard. I hadn't told him who I was meeting, but clearly, Elena had. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent except for the hum of expensive machinery. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked out of place, tired eyes, a sweater that had faded to a shade between gray and blue, shoes that had seen too many rainy days. I told myself not to care, but my throat was already dry when the doors opened. Her apartment was more like a gallery than a home, clean lines, wide spaces, warm lighting that softened the sharpness of the modern design. The air smelled faintly of something floral and expensive, a scent that clung to the back of my throat. She was there, waiting by the floor-to-ceiling windows with a glass of wine in her hand, dressed in a simple silk blouse that still somehow looked like luxury. She smiled when she saw me, not in a way that made me feel small, but in a way that made me feel like I was being studied. She gestured to the sofa, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she wanted me to see that nothing in this meeting would be rushed. I sat, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap I could feel my nails pressing into my palms. For a moment, she just looked at me, letting the silence stretch until I shifted in my seat. Then she spoke. "When I said I would buy you, I didn't mean in the way you might think." Her voice was calm, low, with an undertone that made me feel like I should listen carefully to every word. "I'm offering to take care of you. Rent, food, clothing, whatever you need. In return, I want your company. Your trust. Your time. I'm not interested in some transaction in the traditional sense. I'm interested in you." The word sat heavy between us. I wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. Part of me bristled at the thought, wasn't this just a softer, prettier version of something I'd always told myself I would never do? Another part of me, the part still haunted by the sight of that rent notice, leaned toward the possibility of breathing for the first time in months. I asked her why me, and she tilted her head as if the answer was obvious. "Because you're different. You're not trying to impress me. You're not pretending to be someone you're not. You're just you. And I like that." I didn't know what to say to that. Compliments from strangers had always felt like they came with strings, but hers sounded like she'd already decided the strings were hers to hold. She didn't try to convince me, didn't push for a decision right away. Instead, she poured me a glass of water and asked about my day, about my favorite meals, about whether I preferred the ocean or the mountains. It felt strangely disarming, answering such ordinary questions in a place where everything felt extraordinary. At one point, she leaned back against the sofa, swirling her wine as she studied me again. "You need someone in your corner," she said softly. "Someone who doesn't walk away when things get ugly. I can be that for you, if you let me." The way she said it made my chest ache, because she spoke like someone who knew exactly what it was like to be left behind. I stared at the city skyline through the glass, the lights below flickering like they belonged to another world. I thought about the month ahead, about what it would mean to let someone like her into my life. I thought about how dangerous it was to owe someone, not just money, but pieces of yourself. Yet I heard my own voice say yes, almost before I realized the word had formed. A trial, 1 month, no promises beyond that. Her smile was slow, satisfied, and she reached for her phone, tapping out something I couldn't see. "Then it's settled," she said. "We'll start tomorrow. Everything you need will be taken care of." Her tone was final, but not cold. It was the kind of tone that didn't need to demand obedience, it simply expected it. I left her apartment with the keycard still in my pocket, the night air hitting me like a wave, and as I walked toward the bus stop, I couldn't tell whether I had just saved myself, or given something away I could never get back. The change was immediate, almost disorienting. The very next morning, I woke to the sound of a knock on my door, not the harsh pounding of a landlord, but a gentle rap that came with the muffled voice of a delivery driver. When I opened it, there were bags at my feet, neatly packed and labeled with my name. Inside, I found groceries that looked nothing like the cheap instant meals I was used to: fresh vegetables, fruit so ripe it felt soft under my fingers, bread that still smelled warm from the bakery. There were also things I hadn't asked for but instantly noticed: my favorite tea brand, a specific jar of honey I'd once mentioned in passing at the cafe, even the exact brand of shampoo I'd been saving up to replace. It was as if she had been paying attention to details I didn't even know I'd shared. I told myself it was just generosity, but there was something unsettling about how precise it all was. By the end of that week, my rent was paid directly to the landlord without a single word from me. New clothes began appearing, subtle, not flashy, but undeniably expensive, and in colors I usually chose for myself. I didn't have to shop, didn't have to calculate if I could afford laundry detergent or bus fare. The gaps in my life that had once felt like gaping wounds were being filled before I could even think to ask. Yet with every comfort came a weight I couldn't name. I began to feel as though every choice I made was being observed, perhaps even anticipated. I would reach for a worn sweater, only to find it had been replaced with something softer, finer. I would think about going to the market, only to have my phone buzz with a message from her: "Don't bother. I've sent someone." Elena herself seemed to drift in and out of my days with the same quiet control. She never announced her arrivals, she simply appeared, always composed, always with a gaze that seemed to look straight through the surface of me. She never asked for anything obvious in return, not my body, not declarations of loyalty, but her presence alone made me aware of how much of my life was no longer in my hands. When we spoke, it wasn't idle conversation. She asked about how I was sleeping, whether the noise from the street bothered me, what I dreamed about when I closed my eyes. She listened in a way that made me feel seen, and that was its own kind of PowerPoint. One evening, she came by with dinner, an arrangement of dishes I couldn't pronounce but couldn't stop eating. She didn't stay long, just sat across from me, watching with quiet satisfaction as I ate more than I had in days. At one point, she reached across the table to brush a crumb from the corner of my mouth, her touch feather-light, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. She didn't comment on it, didn't make it into anything more, but the memory lingered like the taste of the food. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering what she saw when she looked at me, and why I felt both safe and trapped under that gaze. Days blurred together, the rhythm of my life changing without me noticing. The worry that had once kept me awake at night, about rent, about bills, about food, was gone, replaced by a quieter, more insidious awareness that I no longer existed entirely on my own terms. It was intoxicating and unnerving all at once. I would catch myself smiling when her name appeared on my phone, and then immediately feel a pang of guilt, as though I were letting myself slip into something I didn't fully understand. There was a question at the back of my mind I couldn't shake: why me? Why this level of attention? And if there was a price, why hadn't she named it yet? That silence, that absence of demand, made me even more restless, because I knew that nothing in life ever came free, not even kindness that felt like care. It was almost 2 weeks into the arrangement when the air between us began to shift in ways I couldn't quite name. The gestures were the same, her sending groceries, checking in on me, appearing unannounced with something I didn't know I needed, but there was a new weight to her presence. That evening, she invited me to her apartment again. When I stepped inside, the lighting was softer than before, golden and low, and the air carried the faint scent of jasmine. A record player in the corner hummed with slow, almost haunting music. She handed me a glass of wine before I could protest and guided me toward the couch, her hand resting lightly against the small of my back. It was such a small touch, but it stayed there long enough to make my heart beat faster. We talked at first about ordinary things, my work schedule, a book she thought I'd like, but there was a slowness in the way she spoke, as though every word was being measured, placed carefully between us. She sat close enough that her perfume curled around me in invisible ribbons, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. Somewhere between one sip of wine and the next, she began to tell me about her past, not the polished version I'd imagined but something rawer. She spoke of long stretches of loneliness, of friends who had disappeared when her success became too visible, of relationships that had started with passion and ended in cold indifference. "People see money and think they see you," she said, her gaze fixed on a point in the distance. "But they're only looking at the surface. They never really want to know the rest." There was something in her voice, a thread of vulnerability so unexpected that I didn't know how to respond. For the first time since I'd met her, I saw more than control. I saw the edges of someone who knew the ache of being wanted for the wrong reasons. The room felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. I tried to look away, but my eyes kept coming back to her, her steady expression, the faint lines of tiredness at the corners of her eyes, the way her fingers traced the rim of her glass. When she turned toward me again, she reached out and brushed a strand of hair away from my face. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, and her fingers lingered against my cheek for a second longer than necessary. I didn't flinch, but every muscle in my body felt alive, aware. I searched her face for meaning, wondering if she realized what she was doing, if she wanted me to notice. Her eyes met mine and held them, and in that moment, the room went quiet except for the slow pulse in my ears. She withdrew her hand slowly, as if testing whether I would follow the touch, and I almost did. We didn't speak for a while after that. She leaned back, sipping her wine, and I focused on the patterns of light on the floor, trying to steady my breathing. Yet beneath the quiet, something had shifted. The boundary between us had blurred, not broken, not yet, but enough to make me aware that we were no longer just a wealthy woman and the girl she'd chosen to help. There was an undercurrent now, a pull I couldn't explain but didn't want to deny. That night, when I finally left her apartment, the scent of jasmine still clung to my clothes, and her touch, light, brief, but unforgettable, stayed with me long after the city lights swallowed me up. I lay awake until dawn, thinking about the way her eyes had softened when she looked at me, and how dangerous it felt to want to see that look again. The days that followed began to feel less like survival and more like slipping into a life I hadn't realized I'd been craving. I still woke up each morning with that old instinct to check my bank account, to brace for bad news, but the fear that had once knotted in my chest was gone. Elena had woven herself into my daily rhythm without asking permission, and it was both unsettling and comforting in equal measure. We saw each other more often now, sometimes in her apartment, sometimes in mine, though she always seemed slightly out of place in my cramped space, like a rare painting hanging in a dim hallway. One evening, she arrived carrying a basket of fresh herbs, vegetables, and spices I didn't recognize, telling me she was going to teach me how to cook something from her childhood. I stood beside her in my small kitchen, watching as her hands moved with practiced ease, slicing and seasoning with the kind of patience that made every movement feel intentional. She told me stories in between steps, memories of standing on a stool in her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of garlic and olive oil filling the air, the way food had been a language of love in her family. I listened quietly, not wanting to interrupt, caught between the pull of her voice and the comfort of the smells filling the room. When I laughed at one of her childhood stories, she looked at me in that way she always did, direct, steady, as though she was collecting pieces of me to keep. After dinner, we lingered at the table, plates pushed aside, talking about things I had never told anyone else. I told her about the scar on my knee from when I fell off my bike as a kid, about the teacher who once told me I'd never amount to much, about the way I used to imagine a different version of myself living a better life somewhere far away. She didn't pity me, didn't rush to comfort me, she just listened, her gaze warm and unwavering. The more I spoke, the more I felt something shifting inside me, like I was handing her small keys to doors I'd kept locked for years. In the days that followed, these exchanges became our unspoken ritual. She would share something of herself, a small confession, a memory, a dream, and I would match it with something of my own. It was a slow exchange of trust, and it made the space between us feel smaller. Yet, beneath the warmth, a quiet unease lingered. I noticed that I hadn't seen my old friends in weeks, that I no longer went places without telling her first. I caught myself hesitating before making decisions, wondering how she might react. It wasn't that she demanded control, it was that I had started to give it to her without thinking. One rainy afternoon, I found myself curled on her couch, sipping tea she'd brewed for me. She sat beside me, reading something on her tablet, the quiet between us so natural it felt like we'd known each other for years. I studied the curve of her profile, the way her hair caught the light, and for the first time, I realized how much I wanted to reach out, to touch her. The thought startled me, not because it was unwelcome, but because it felt inevitable. She glanced up and caught me looking, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, recognition, maybe even invitation, but she didn't speak. Instead, she closed her tablet and asked if I wanted to take a walk in the rain. We stepped outside without umbrellas, letting the drizzle soak into our clothes as we wandered through quiet streets. She didn't touch me, but she walked close enough that our shoulders brushed occasionally, sending small jolts of awareness through me. By the time we returned, my hair was plastered to my face, and I was laughing at nothing in particular. She handed me a towel, her fingers grazing mine, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow down to just that small point of contact. I went home that night feeling both lighter and heavier, lighter because of the warmth she'd left behind, heavier because I knew I was already further in than I'd meant to be. I told myself I could still pull back if I needed to, that I could walk away before it became too much. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't. Something about her had already rooted itself in me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to let it go. Even as I tried to convince myself that this was still just an arrangement, the truth was already clear in the way my heart quickened when she called, in the way her absence felt like a missing piece I didn't know how to replace. And the most dangerous part was that I didn't want to replace it at all. The days that followed began to feel less like survival and more like slipping into a life I hadn't realized I'd been craving. I still woke up each morning with that old instinct to check my bank account, to brace for bad news, but the fear that had once knotted in my chest was gone. Elena had woven herself into my daily rhythm without asking permission, and it was both unsettling and comforting in equal measure. We saw each other more often now, sometimes in her apartment, sometimes in mine, though she always seemed slightly out of place in my cramped space, like a rare painting hanging in a dim hallway. One evening, she arrived carrying a basket of fresh herbs, vegetables, and spices I didn't recognize, telling me she was going to teach me how to cook something from her childhood. I stood beside her in my small kitchen, watching as her hands moved with practiced ease, slicing and seasoning with the kind of patience that made every movement feel intentional. She told me stories in between steps, memories of standing on a stool in her grandmother's kitchen, the smell of garlic and olive oil filling the air, the way food had been a language of love in her family. I listened quietly, not wanting to interrupt, caught between the pull of her voice and the comfort of the smells filling the room. When I laughed at one of her childhood stories, she looked at me in that way she always did, direct, steady, as though she was collecting pieces of me to keep. After dinner, we lingered at the table, plates pushed aside, talking about things I had never told anyone else. I told her about the scar on my knee from when I fell off my bike as a kid, about the teacher who once told me I'd never amount to much, about the way I used to imagine a different version of myself living a better life somewhere far away. She didn't pity me, didn't rush to comfort me, she just listened, her gaze warm and unwavering. The more I spoke, the more I felt something shifting inside me, like I was handing her small keys to doors I'd kept locked for years. In the days that followed, these exchanges became our unspoken ritual. She would share something of herself, a small confession, a memory, a dream, and I would match it with something of my own. It was a slow exchange of trust, and it made the space between us feel smaller. Yet, beneath the warmth, a quiet unease lingered. I noticed that I hadn't seen my old friends in weeks, that I no longer went places without telling her first. I caught myself hesitating before making decisions, wondering how she might react. It wasn't that she demanded control, it was that I had started to give it to her without thinking. One rainy afternoon, I found myself curled on her couch, sipping tea she'd brewed for me. She sat beside me, reading something on her tablet, the quiet between us so natural it felt like we'd known each other for years. I studied the curve of her profile, the way her hair caught the light, and for the first time, I realized how much I wanted to reach out, to touch her. The thought startled me, not because it was unwelcome, but because it felt inevitable. She glanced up and caught me looking, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, recognition, maybe even invitation, but she didn't speak. Instead, she closed her tablet and asked if I wanted to take a walk in the rain. We stepped outside without umbrellas, letting the drizzle soak into our clothes as we wandered through quiet streets. She didn't touch me, but she walked close enough that our shoulders brushed occasionally, sending small jolts of awareness through me. By the time we returned, my hair was plastered to my face, and I was laughing at nothing in particular. She handed me a towel, her fingers grazing mine, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to narrow down to just that small point of contact. I went home that night feeling both lighter and heavier, lighter because of the warmth she'd left behind, heavier because I knew I was already further in than I'd meant to be. I told myself I could still pull back if I needed to, that I could walk away before it became too much. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't. Something about her had already rooted itself in me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to let it go. Even as I tried to convince myself that this was still just an arrangement, the truth was already clear in the way my heart quickened when she called, in the way her absence felt like a missing piece I didn't know how to replace. And the most dangerous part was that I didn't want to replace it at all. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, one of those gray days where the air feels heavy and the light never quite brightens. I had been sitting by the window, half reading a book, when the sharp knock came at my door. For a moment, my chest tightened with an old reflex, thinking it might be the landlord again, even though I knew that problem had been erased by Elena weeks ago. When I opened the door, it was not him, it was Jenna, my oldest friend, standing there with the same sharp eyes she had when we were kids, scanning me from head to toe as if she was looking for damage. She stepped inside without asking, her gaze lingering on the small details of my apartment. The fresh flowers on the table, the clean counters, the neatly folded clothes draped over the chair. "You're doing well for someone who was 2 days from eviction last month," she said, the edge in her voice slicing through the air. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound came out flat. She didn't smile. She asked outright how I could afford all this, and when I hesitated, her expression shifted into something close to disgust. "So what, you're living off her now? Letting some rich woman take care of you like you're her pet?" The word hit me harder than I expected, probably because it echoed a thought I'd tried to bury deep. I told her she didn't understand, that it wasn't like that, but even to my own ears my voice sounded defensive. She rolled her eyes, muttered something about me losing myself, and left as quickly as she'd arrived. The silence that followed felt sharp, pressing into my skin. I sat on the couch for a long time afterward, Jenna's words looping in my head. Living off her pet, losing myself. I didn't want to believe any of it, but I couldn't shake the small, unwelcome seed of doubt she had planted. That evening, Elena came by unannounced, as she often did, carrying a small box with my favorite pastries. She noticed immediately that something was off. "What happened?" she asked, setting the box down without opening it. I tried to brush it off, but she simply sat down beside me, waiting in that patient way of hers that made silence feel heavier than words. Eventually, it spilled out, Jenna's visit, her accusations, the way it had made me feel small and dependent. For a long moment, Elena didn't speak. Then she reached for my hand, her fingers wrapping around mine with a steadiness that grounded me. "You're not here because I bought you," she said quietly, her voice so certain it almost startled me. "You're here because I wanted you to feel chosen." because I saw someone worth choosing. The words sank into me slowly, their warmth pushing back against the cold not left by Jenna's voice. Still, part of me hesitated, unsure if being chosen was any different from being claimed. But when I looked at Elena, at the way she was watching me, without pity, without expectation, I felt something else stir. Gratitude, yes, but also an ache that had been building quietly for weeks, an ache that had nothing to do with money or survival. I realized then that I had stopped thinking of this as just an arrangement. Somewhere between the grocery deliveries, the quiet dinners, and the long conversations, it had become something far more tangled and dangerous. She stayed longer that night, not to distract me, but simply to be there. We didn't talk much after that. She made tea, we ate the pastries, and when she finally stood to leave, her hand lingered on my shoulder for a moment longer than necessary. After the door closed behind her, I sat in the dim light, turning her words over in my mind. "You're here because I wanted you to feel chosen." No one had ever said anything like that to me before, and the truth was, it terrified me as much as it warmed me. Because if I stayed, if I kept letting her into all the corners of my life, I knew there would come a day when I couldn't imagine it without her, and that was a kind of vulnerability I wasn't sure I knew how to survive. It was late, the kind of late where the city outside seemed to have exhaled into stillness, leaving only the faint hum of distant traffic. I was at her apartment again, this time not because she had asked, but because I had wanted to be there. We had spent the evening sprawled on her couch, drinking wine and talking about nothing and everything, the kind of talk that loops in circles and drifts into long, comfortable silences. The room was warm, the curtains drawn, the scent of her jasmine candle curling lazily in the air. I could feel the weight of the day slipping away, replaced by something softer, slower. She was sitting close enough that I could see the faintest freckles along her collarbone, close enough that when she laughed, I could feel the warmth of her breath on my cheek. There was a point where the conversation simply stopped, not because it had run out, but because something heavier had settled between us. Her eyes found mine, steady, searching, and in that pause the air seemed to thicken. I didn't know who leaned in first, maybe it was both of us, but suddenly her lips were brushing against mine, soft and tentative, as if she was asking a question without words. My breath caught. For a heartbeat, I froze, not from fear but from the shock of how natural it felt. Then I kissed her back, my hand instinctively finding the side of her face, her skin warm beneath my palm. The kiss deepened, slow and deliberate, not rushed, as if neither of us wanted to risk shattering whatever this was by moving too quickly. Her hand slid to the back of my neck, her fingers threading through my hair, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. The wine was forgotten, the soft music in the background a distant hum. Every part of me was aware of her, the way her body leaned into mine, the way she breathed against my mouth, the way her touch seemed to speak a language I had always known but never heard aloud. When she pulled back, it was only far enough to look at me, her thumb brushing along my jaw. There was no smirk, no calculated expression, just an openness that made my chest ache. I didn't know what I looked like in that moment, but I could feel the flush on my cheeks, the faint tremor in my hands. She kissed me again, slower this time, as if savoring the moment, and I let myself sink into it, into her. The rest of the night unfolded without hurry. We moved as though we had all the time in the world, each touch unspoken but understood. She was careful with me, not fragile but intentional, and I found myself matching her pace, mirroring her gentleness. It was not about urgency, it was about the quiet certainty that we were crossing into a place we couldn't return from. By the time we drifted into sleep, the faint light from the window casting soft shadows across the bed, I felt an unfamiliar peace settle over me. When I woke the next morning, sunlight was spilling across the sheets, warm against my skin. She was already awake, propped up on one elbow, watching me with a look I couldn't quite name, something between affection and possession, though not in a way that made me recoil. I felt the urge to say something, to define what had happened, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I just smiled, small and unguarded, and she returned it with one of her own. Lying there, I realized that whatever this was, it had shifted. I no longer felt like something she had bought or rescued out of pity. I felt claimed, yes, but not in chains, in something that felt strangely mutual. The idea of leaving her, of returning to the life I had before, seemed suddenly unthinkable. I didn't know if that was love or dependency or some dangerous combination of both, but I knew that a line had been crossed, and I wasn't sure I wanted to step back. If anything, part of me was already wondering how much deeper I could fall. The weeks that followed blurred together in a way that felt both dizzying and strangely calm, as if time itself had shifted to accommodate this new life I was living. Days no longer revolved around overdue bills or the constant dread of eviction notices. Instead, mornings began with the smell of her coffee drifting through the air, the soft rustle of her moving about the kitchen, and the quiet comfort of knowing I wasn't alone anymore. At first, I kept waiting for the moment it would all fall apart, for her to wake up one day and decide I wasn't worth the trouble, or for me to realize that this was just another form of dependence dressed up in luxury. But each day passed without that breaking point, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to imagine my life without her in it. She never once asked me to be anything I wasn't. There were no rules, no contracts, no whispered reminders of what she had done for me. Instead, she gave me space when I needed it and pulled me close when I didn't know I did. That didn't mean there weren't moments of tension, there were. Small arguments over nothing, flashes of insecurity that still rose to the surface when I least expected them. One night, I asked her why she had made me that offer in the first place, the night everything changed. She didn't look away when she answered. Because I saw you drowning, and I knew I could pull you out. But I also knew I wanted you in my life. Not for a moment. For as long as you'd let me. There was no hesitation in her voice, no hint that it had ever been about control. The truth was simpler and far more dangerous. She had chosen me because she wanted me, and somewhere along the way, I had chosen her back. I started working again, not because she asked, but because I wanted to feel my own footing again. She encouraged it, proud but never possessive, always reminding me that my worth wasn't tied to a paycheck. Yet even with that independence returning, I found myself gravitating toward her at the end of each day, the rhythm of my life now syncing naturally with hers. It wasn't the arrangement it had started as. Somewhere in the quiet moments, the shared meals, the long walks, the nights we stayed up talking until dawn, it had become something far messier and far more real. Love, if I was honest with myself. The kind that didn't shout but sank into your bones, making its presence known in every choice, every breath. The kind that made you understand why some people would give up everything just to keep it. One evening, as we stood on her balcony watching the city lights flicker against the dark, she slipped her hand into mine. There was no speech, no declaration, just that quiet, steady touch. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. I didn't just owe her my gratitude anymore, I owed her my heart, and I was giving it freely, without hesitation. The fear that had once kept me on guard had faded into something else entirely. I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living. And I was living with her. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more emotional and powerful LGBTQ stories. Share it with someone who needs to hear this, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your words mean more than you know.